information of individuals, as this would infringe the data protection rights of the individual. And can everyone please mute their microphones when not speaking? Okay, so first item on the agenda is apologies for absence. So I believe we've got apologies from Councillor Albone and Councillor Grant-Fage. We also have Councillor Ramsey, who's attending online, so won't be able to vote. Any other apologies? No. Okay, thank you. So moving on to declarations of interest. To receive statutory declarations of interest for members in relation to disclosable pecuniary interests in any agenda item or non-pecuniary interests in any agenda item. So are there any interests? No. Okay, move on. Chairman's announcements. I've got no chairman's announcements to make this meeting, which brings us on to the public open session. We don't have any public in the room or online, so I'll move on to the next item, which is invited speaker, of which there isn't one. So item 6, members' questions. Are there any members' questions? No. Okay, so minutes and recommendations of meetings. So first, to consider the accuracy of the minutes of the Finance and General Purposes Committee meeting held on the 15th of March 2022. So I'll start on page 5. Page 6. Page 7. Page 8. Page 9. No. Okay. Do I have a proposer that they're accurate?
Move it.
Seconded. All in favour? Thank you very much. So now moving on to matters arising. First on page 5. Page 6. Page 7. Councillor Foster.
Yeah, I just wondered whether we could have a bit of an update on where we are in relation to the finance review, given that the oral update was from the head of planning and finance, and we had a deadline the 31st of March. I'm just keen to understand where we're up to, please.
One of the challenges that we have left is to make sure that we have a proper finance resource wrapped around us. So we've completed about 45% of the recommendations. We've made good progress, obviously, with the financial regulations, but there are some other policy-related matters that haven't gone through councillors yet, e.g. change of bank. So we're making good progress. One of the first things our finance manager will do when they start on Friday the 15th will to bring some absolute clarity to a calendar timeline associated with that.
Any more on page 7? Page 8, Councillor Foster again.
Yeah, I mean, we've got the Biggleswade Town Council website. I know from the minutes that it's the admin HR manager was going to do an update and some further action. I just wonder what's happened since then, please.
Yeah, so I can give an update on that. Essentially, due to workload, the report wasn't quite ready for this meeting, but it's a plan to bring it to full council either next week or next time or the one after that. Next week. Yeah. Anything else on page 8? Page 9. Okay. That's no more matters arising. We move on to items for consideration. Item 9A, payments process unit to Trust Bank. So, Mr. Tarrant, can you please introduce the item?
Yeah, so hopefully members will have had time to read and digest the report. This is in response to the question that members left with me previously in regard to defining the process connected to the new bank in the sense of our electronic payments. So this seeks to clarify a process both in regard to regular payments and non-regular payments. And it also seeks to clarify members' roles connected to that. I think one of the most important messages within this report is that from a financial governance perspective, we're seeking to almost bring together the best of the new and indeed the best of the old. And the best of the old is to get members involved early on in the sign-off process. That also means physical attendance at the town hall. So members will look at the invoices, they'll look at the purchase orders, they will sign them off at that first point. And when that's completed, that member then has the opportunity of going online and releasing payment. Payment can't be, the member who does that has to be the person who also releases. So it brings the best of the old and the best of the new, I think, connected to the process.
Thank you. Councillor Mark.
Yes, they can, yes, if they wish to.
Thank you. On a very similar point, in the report, it states that members will be required to maintain at home software to satisfy security and enable online payments. What is the situation if members do not actually have that particular facility at home? How's it going to be provided and at whose expense?
Well, I think one of the things that we're going to be obliged to do if this report goes through is to do some form of a security check on the members' individual personal devices to make sure that they will now be compliant with the new bank's expectations. I think if most members have a relatively modern laptop and keep up to date in regard to the software updates, they're probably going to be compliant, but we will need to check that prior to doing so. I think council will also have to come to a view about whether or not it's appropriate for council to make a contribution or to pay for any required updates to associate a member to fulfill the requirements of their role. That's not for me to say.
If I could say from the chair, the current system with Lloyds will also have minimum requirements expected in that system for access, which up to this point we haven't checked as to whether members' systems actually are up to the relevant standard for that. So having a requirement in itself isn't something that should be new, but actually by introducing this, we're actually going to confirm that that is in place, whereas currently we don't check that members' systems have the appropriate security. Councillor Knight.
Thank you. So I think the procedure seems fairly straightforward, and I think I could probably follow it. I would suggest that if we adopt it, and I will in a moment propose that we do, that it should be reviewed probably after the first month to see if it needs to be updated, following people starting to actually use it, and then probably again after 3 or 6 months, because I suspect there will be some difference between what is proposed here and what turns out to be common practice, and making sure that's documented and shared with all people, all members that are participating, I think is valuable. A couple of very minor nits on the first page of the policy. The last bullet point, the invoice is being paid within a reasonable time period, e.g. no longer than 30 days. I suspect that's meant to be i.e. rather than e.g. That would be less ambiguous. And then moving down to the flow chart, again, a bit of a nit, Appendix B, internet-enabled device required with latest antivirus software installed. I presume it would be perfectly acceptable to use something like an Apple iPad. And if that is compatible with the system, they typically don't have antivirus software. So not all devices will necessarily need that, but they will need to be running the latest operating system.
Okay. The reason why I put that into the flowchart was that when I read through in detail the many documentation that sits on Unity Bank, and everything is online, obviously, they were very clear in their expectations of that case. But I suspect that you're right.
Yeah, so certainly for PCs, that makes complete sense. It makes slightly less sense, I would suggest, for mobile, certain mobile phones and certain tablets. But with those small nits, I would like to propose that we adopt this procedure, please.
Councillor Foster.
Yeah, I might, just in relation to the point about personal equipment, as far as I can see, it doesn't make any reference to the fact that members might be able to use equipment within the town hall. So I think that should be something that's included in this, because I think that's important, because some members won't be comfortable with having to have security or having town council security elements on their own machine. So I think that's something that's important. There's a point here about the account code is consistent with the type of expenditure. Again, as a not having sign checks before and around the process, clearly it's important that if we're going to be allocating them, that members either have a list or understand what the process is. So is there I'm not sure what the mechanism, so to be clear on that, if you want to answer that, I'll come on. I've got a couple of other points, but
Okay. So let me answer the first point first. So we do have a member breakout room here to my left-hand side, and I think that can be easily adapted to make sure that there's always technology in place for members who do wish to release on site. So that's certainly available. Your second point was
just around the account code being consistent. Yeah. So the list.
Yeah. So I think this on the second page of the report, if I remember writing it, we were talking about the opportunity for members to go on to Unity Bank and to do the Unity Bank online learning, which I think would be valid. But at the same time, for those who haven't released before, I think there's probably an internal session that we might want to offer, just so that you're kind of used to our account structures. Yeah. And the reason why I put that down was that, you know, it's for members to critique and to make sure that there's nothing of a, that looks peculiarly private sector orientated, to make sure that we are sector orientated.
My query really was, are we allocating, if members are authorising expenditure that is going into the right place, that's fine. I've got a question around the who authorises uploading onto the Unity Bank system by the Internet Banking Administrator. Who does that in the absence of this particular person?
Well, I think we'll have to put in place, I mean, we have an accounts clerk, so I anticipate probably the accounts clerk being able to do that, should that person be away, and or either the head of governance and strategic partnerships or the clerk.
Okay, thank you. I think that covers it. I've made this at the point about stuff at home, etc. So I think that's it. They're my questions. Thank you.
Councillor Strawn, did we have a seconder first of all for Councillor Knight's proposal at this point? Okay, thank you, Councillor Foster. Councillor Strawn.
Yeah, just coming back on the point about officers being authorised, I think it's important that we make sure that any proposal that actually goes forward actually has the ability that a procedure for appointing a substitute officer. Otherwise, we would be, if we set it down in tablets of stone, without that, we can then be up a creek without a paddle.
Yeah, entirely agree with your observations, Councillor Strawn. Yeah.
Okay. I did have one question myself, specifically in relation to the fifth bullet point around what members satisfy themselves about. So the invoices paid within a reasonable time period, i.e. now no longer than 30 days from receipt of services or product. I guess my concern there is 30 days is probably too short a period, because if we receive a service, they don't invoice it for a couple of weeks, and then they've got a 30-day payment terms, then we're going to be on 30 days of receiving the service, and therefore we wouldn't be able to meet that.
I partly agree and partly disagree. So I think my experience is that good businesses try to strive towards doing that if they possibly can. And the 30 days, I have to say, was a kind of best practice indicator I put down without a huge amount of thought connected to that. What I'm also conscious of is that part of our role as a council, I think, is to support and motivate our business community. And if it's possible and represents good value for money, to use local businesses if we're able. I'm also conscious that we should do everything possible to pay them within what we deem to be a reasonable period, so that it doesn't impact on them.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I guess my point is, if something comes and it's 45 days, this reads as if, well, you can't approve it then, which actually delays things even further, not speeding it up.
I agree.
So that's the point I was trying to make.
I agree, but I think internally, we should do everything possible to make sure we pay things
Yeah,
within a reasonable time.
agreed.
Yeah.
Could I just follow up? And maybe it should be in relation to 30 days from the invoice rather than 30 days from the receipt of the, so that, and I guess because some of our suppliers will have some formal terms anyway, but it shouldn't be any longer than 30 days for me beyond the invoice. And I think maybe is a change that we could make, which is reasonable.
Okay. Councillor Strawn.
I think the EG explains the 30 days rather than IE, because the IE is a definite. The EG is the example of the principle.
Are you happy to go back to EG? Yeah. Okay. So I believe. Oh, sorry, Councillor Russell.
Just to say two things. As far as the point that Councillor Foster made about accounts codes, there's been awful lot of wrong coding in the past, and I hope that we've now got a proper set of codes and that everybody will know them. And I think that everybody who is a signatory should have a list of those account codes as something that they keep permanently. And the other thing I wanted to say was the process that's set out here in the flow charts is not exactly the same as the one that I've been having to use for Unity Trust Bank. I accept that the clerk has been talking to Unity Trust and also to other councils that use the process. So we'll see what happens, but it's not my experience. It's not the complete process.
Okay. So to summarise the proposal then, it was to accept the process with a change around the virus, so antivirus software piece on page 14. So internet enabled device required with appropriate security, was that the sort of wording?
I think that would work, wouldn't it? And were there any other amendments we need to pick up in the room?
And there was on page 12, as well as seeking to define the process, the appendices give information around the nature of the ICT software that members will be required to maintain at home to satisfy security and enable online payments, or use of council equipment.
Correct. And to review the process after 1 month
And
of
then-
operation.
To review the process after 1 month and then after a further period.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So all in favour of that then, please? Any against? Abstentions? That's carried then. Thank you. Move on to item 9B, the Christmas tender updates. So, Mr. Saini, I believe you're going to introduce this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, on the Christmas procurement, officers have to date reached out to existing suppliers that we've had from last year, plus a few additional ones that we've picked up along the way in the months following last Christmas, to ascertain kind of the level of buy-in for our Christmas offer generally. And the report obviously sets out some firm quotes received to date. On the entire offer, we've essentially simultaneously, to ensure full buy-in from as many suppliers as we possibly can, including new ones, for our kind of unique Christmas offer. We've launched a contractsfinder.gov.uk procurement tender expression of interest exercise. And so far, I'm delighted to report we've actually got 288 views from that. That particular invitation of expressions of interest will expire on the 8th of July. That's later this week, clearly. As soon as that has done, we'll be able to, with the place shaping manager back, essentially do a proper cost benefit assessment of everything from A to Z in terms of that, and then ideally bring that back obviously for the next committee, the TCM one. I appreciate that's after the fact, essentially for this committee. Essentially though, we want to be able to kind of maximise our exposure and get everything right here in terms of procurement to fulfil in full the financial regulations. In levels of detail here, to give more of an update essentially on where we're at, we've obviously broken down our offer in terms of by, you know, for the Christmas trees, for the lights, for the light shows, which we still have included just for completeness only, essentially at this point. For festoons, which we're actually calling more motifs now because we've widened that kind of description slightly with new suppliers as well. And for obviously with our grotto. Potentially to provide some wow factor for this coming year, we've got a synthetic ice rink as well, which would be fully staffed, not by ourselves, but by the potential provider. A lot of this information, which I appreciate and unfortunately is still an interim status, is set out in the report and later annexes. And we're striving obviously from next week to be able to provide a clear-cut assessment. I'll pause there actually and invite views.
Okay, thank you. Before I call on Councillor Knight, I just want to make clear there is a confidential paper which identifies all of the suppliers and the amounts that has been provided. Just a reminder to members that is confidential in terms of who the suppliers are. So you can refer to the amounts in there, but please don't refer to the suppliers by name. Councillor Knight.
Okay, I've got quite a few comments, but relatively high level ones. So firstly, thank you to officers for the work they're doing on this. And I think, you know, some of the detail, it's appropriate that you know, around the specification is a matter for TCM that hopefully we can dig into in a couple of weeks' time on the 19th of July. I did have trouble accessing some of the quotes that were embedded into documents on SharePoint. I don't know if any other members had that challenge, but some of the documents had embedded quotes within them that I was unable to access. But I don't think it's a particular problem tonight because I think we're operating at a slightly higher level and don't need to dig into all of that detail. So just a couple of things then in terms of the offer that's proposed. Obviously there's the main switch on event on the 25th of November. That date was set last year and I'm very supportive of the detail around that. There's also I think a proposal in here to have a second light show on the 24th. I don't support that. So originally the light shows were introduced some 2 years ago now, really as part of the challenge we had with COVID. And the fact that we couldn't get the whole community together. So by running a series of light shows, it enabled smaller family groups to come out in a very COVID secure way. I think we've done that for 2 years in a row, and I don't think we should continue with those light shows. And I don't think it makes sense to just do a one-off light show, to be honest. I don't think it would be a big enough spectacle. I think I'd like more detail on the external grotto. I'm not yet comfortable with the idea of outsourcing that versus potentially repairing the grotto we have. I'd like to understand more about the business case, how much we charge, what the net cost to the council would be. But I also recognise there is a need to ensure we have resilience in the grotto because last year, unfortunately, I understand Santa caught a dose of COVID, which he recovered from very successfully. But of course, it meant that in the meantime, there were some disappointed families who couldn't attend. And I hope we can have an offer that is more resilient in the event that someone catches COVID, which is quite likely when you're in close proximity. I think in terms of the costs that are presented, we need to include the costs associated with obtaining the premises license that I believe we're going to talk more about at TCM, but I believe the costs for that are nominal, something like £130 or something, but just for completeness. I don't support the A board here that's proposed at £2,000. Maybe I need more detail to be convinced, but I'm not yet convinced that represents good value. And then finally, I just wanted to say a little bit more about the ice rink. So I don't know if it's well described in here. So the idea of an ice rink was an idea that I floated as a potential alternative to the light show. And my vision was, if we don't do the light show this year, would it be practical to hire essentially an outsourced ice rink for a few days in the Christmas holidays, not at the time of any other event, but to be in the square for, let's say, a few days over Christmas, which could then encourage families and children to come and enjoy that. And of course, that would bring people into the town centre and encourage people to use the town centre. I understand we have a quote for around £5,000. I think I would, before discussing that in too much more detail, I would like to understand a business case for that, because I hope it is an offer we could charge people to use, and that may cover some of the cost. And it would be interesting to understand how much of that £5,000 we could reasonably recoup. And I'd also like to know a little bit more detail about the size and where it could go, because if it's going to go in the square for 2 or 3 days, then we need to know exactly where it would go and understand it's not going to interfere with other activities. But I think it's an exciting and different offer for the community, and that would encourage people into the town. But I'd like to ask for a bit more detail, and maybe again that's something we could bring back to a future meeting. Those were my initial comments. Thank you.
Councillor North. Can you use your microphone, please?
Regarding the ice rink, I think it's a wonderful idea and it sounds marvellous. And it's good that people have new ideas, but I would just point out that the budget, the outline budget here, is £5,000 more than what's been allocated in the budget. Or let's say the expected cost is £5,000 more than the budget. The ice rink costs approximately £5,000. So I would suggest it may not be the right time to actually do it at all, actually. And as Councillor Knight is saying, I'm not sure that it should be held at the time of the switch on anyway, because it gets very crowded down there, and I don't know where exactly you would put it, bearing in mind the layout of the whole thing. So anyway, that's all. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Foster.
I'm in danger of going down perhaps in too much detail around the offer rather than the financial. So I think that's sort of a difficulty with being presented with numbers and then something behind. So some of my questions will be relating a little bit to do with the offer, and I guess may have to attend TCM to get a clear idea. But one of the things that I noticed was around festoons. And then I'm a little bit confused by the terminology festoons on here that relates to 422 metres and 472 metres with swag. So that's fine. But then you've also got references to festoons and motifs, which is then thrown me completely. So there is that. We can come on to that in a second. Obviously, I'm glad that we've got some variety on there. I have similar concerns around the ice rink in terms of the practicality of it and sort of how it works and the financials behind it. Having had experience of in a past life of running ice rinks, I know the sort of the pitfalls that go with it around. So it's certainly, if we were going to go along that route, it would be something we would have to have no responsibility at all for, because of the staffing and the safety element. But there's always a risk with ice rinks in any format that people are going to be injured. And that's a real problem for us. And I guess I have similar concerns as Councillor Knight around the necessity for the A board and sort of whether this is a requirement for part of the Christmas offer, or whether it's something we should be including as a council offer in general. So that's a factor here. And I think there was the other thing around the grotto, and I just really want to understand the sort of what was going to happen around that, and the £495 of it just seems we've got to explore different options. But I think that's and sorry, just on the ice rink, £5,100 for 3 days. It does seem quite a cost, and we would have to justify that. So, and I'm not sure whether the benefit, so we would perhaps need to understand what the public views on this sort of thing, what might be, whether it's something that there's both the business case and actually the viability, and whether people actually think it's a good idea as well. So we've got our own ideas, but I think it's sort of, we've got to take that into consideration.
Councillor Russell.
Can I just mention the electrical updates that are laid out here? I understand the need for it and I'm not against it, but could we possibly obtain some Section 106 monies for that? Because we need to be aware of how much money we're investing in infrastructure, which is not ours. The square belongs to Central Bedfordshire Council, not to the Town Council. And if we're going to invest a lot of money, then we need to be discussing with Central Bedfordshire, A, whether they're happy with what we're doing, and B, whether there's Section 106 money or whether they're prepared to at least halve the cost with us. Thank you.
Councillor Strawn.
A couple of points. I was going to raise the question of the electrical works. I don't see that necessarily the Town Council should actually be paying any money towards it, as it is, as I understood it, belongs to Central Beds, and they should have it up to the appropriate standard. So clearly it needs to be done, but I don't think it should necessarily be done at any expense to this council, including using up Section 106 monies, which we might be able to put to a better use. So that's my observation there. Secondly, I'll share the concerns over the A board. That didn't make any sense to me, so I think that seems to be fairly common. But just from the sake of clarity of what we're deciding today, because this is the finance element of the meeting, looking at the recommendation, there's going to be a selection on the 19th of July when clearly finances will be taken into account at that date. So I'm not going to go into any of the figure work or anything else that we've been looking at tonight, but what do we actually need to approve tonight from a financial point of view as Finance Committee, so that when we go to the Town Centre Management Committee meeting, we've actually got a clear authority to progress it to the next stage without having to revert back to this committee in any shape or form. I accept that it should probably go to council, but I think we need to just establish what the remit of this committee is for tonight, and then to give that remit, what remit then goes and with what authority to Town Centre Management.
So from the chair, my understanding of what we're required to do from a procurement perspective and from this committee perspective is there is already an approved budget of 18,000 for the festoons and 7,000 for the remaining Christmas items, a total of 25,000. My understanding is we need to indicate that we're happy for necessary variance between those two funds to allocate less to the festoons and more to the other Christmas activities, depending on the specific outcome of the procurement exercise. And also, should there be a requirement for the ice rink, how that needs to be managed from a vehement perspective. Now, I get a sense of a feeling that we're not ready to accept the ice rink at this point, so that may be something that's deferred to a later date if there is a need for it. But certainly around the £25,000 budget, I think it's a case of giving the flexibility to use that as required within that bucket.
That makes perfect sense to me, apart from the fact that if I've done a very rough maths in my head correctly, if we had everything there that we were looking at as potential, the potential cost is in excess of the 25,000. I may not have done that right because I only seen this particular part today. So is there likely to be, or maybe the possibility that we might need, or Town Centre Management might need, an authority to go to a greater degree, whether by environment or whatever, or is the Town Centre Management's authority going to be limited to a maximum of 25?
I mean, I'm getting indications from officers that 25 should be sufficient, subject to all of the quotes coming in and the fact that it wouldn't include at this stage the ice rink.
You go on, Graham.
Thanks, Mr. Town Clerk. So, I suppose, and thanks to all members here, actually. Essentially, big picture first, I suppose. We've got. I should have said, and I hadn't mentioned directly, that we're still awaiting the first quote, let alone two others, for the major infrastructure works in the square, and whether or not that'll be under S106 funding, etc. That's another kind of key matter, I suppose, but we'll get to that. On on other items, so for example, whether it's affordable within whichever specific bucket without having a pot of allocation of funding, without varying from one to the next, etc. Within our overall, what I call control total of 25,000, I think it still should be possible with some moderate flex, subject to whatever the quotes will come for that major work and how that's paid for.
So, I mean, I would say that just on that point though, that any works that are needed to the infrastructure of the market, whether or not they're covered by section 106 or we have to pay for it at some point, that is independent of these specific budget headings. That comes out, ultimately that would be a veerment from our capital reserve. I would suggest as it's capital works or another source that we might identify, but it's certainly not from these specific headings. Councillor Bond.
Considering you've got this report saying, well, you've got this assertion that the electrics are unsafe, do we actually have a report explaining what's wrong and what's actually intended, what needs to be required to sort it out, rather than just almost hearsay saying there's a problem with it?
So thanks, Mr. Chairman. So indeed, we have a site visit which was undertaken over a good day and a half or so from a particular individual who is well known, has a good, very reputable company, and that found that there were elements, without kind of having the report in front of me. I mean, I'm prepared to share obviously elements with it, or sort of a redacted version, should I say, for all committee members, if that's okay for now. It's proper to provide clarity where we're at. Thanks.
Mr. Clark.
Yeah, just for absolute clarity to respond to Councillor Bond's question. So we have all but a retained electrician who normally supports the key events, including the major Christmas lights turn on, etc., etc. So that person is well trusted. And we do have a detailed report from that individual to clearly ascertain where the issues of challenge might be. And there are some quite significant areas that, from a health and safety perspective, do need to be remedied before Christmas comes upon us.
Thank you very much. So I with Councillor Bond's remarks, I agree. We need to understand the difference between the essential electrical work, which is necessary to ensure it is safe, versus perhaps the desirable work that would maybe raise it to a higher standard or improve reliability. And we need to make sure we understand that. And I agree with the comments that were made earlier that in either respect, Central Beds should fund the maintenance of their infrastructure. In terms of the budget, I think it's important, obviously, that TCM sticks within the budget, and if for some reason we can't, that would have to be a recommendation to council that we seek to go above that. But I hope we can stay within the budget. That's certainly my goal. Certainly, if we don't, for example, have the A board, we need to understand what other promotion may be required. But there's a potential saving there. There is potentially some revenue. As I say, there's more detail, I think, on the grotto and the ice rink if we were to proceed with that. But if either or both of those were to generate revenue and that offsets some of the expenditure, understanding where that puts us with respect to the budget would be helpful. So, for example, if we thought, hypothetically, an ice rink could generate £2,000 in revenue and the net cost was 3,000, do we still need to have the budget for the 5,000, or would the budget for the 3,000 be sufficient? As I say, need more information on that. Thank you.
Councillor Russell.
I'm not sure that we have a proposal on the table at the moment.
Not yet, no.
The recommendations that are at the end of the report, I would personally have trouble in approving 2, 4 and 5 at this point in time. The procurement route, fine, and final supplier selection for TCM, that has to happen then. We're already late with deciding this in terms of Christmas provision from previous knowledge. I think the Christmas offer 2022 specification, which is listed in the table above the recommendations, has got things that we've now said we're not happy with. So that's the reason that I don't think we should approve that. We've talked about the electrical improvement work, and Councillor Knight has outlined with Councillor Bond exactly what's required. And I certainly don't think the Digital A Board should be part of the Christmas expenses. And if we've not budgeted for it, we have to wait till next year's budget for that one. So I am happy to propose that we approve items 1 and 3. And I think I'd have to leave it at that at the moment.
Councillor Foster.
So I don't think I think we moved on from my initial question, so around what a festoon is. So before I move on to our next one, can we have an answer on that one? And then I'll move on to a couple of others, please.
Thank you. So the simplest answer for me from you at this point, without the place shaping manager in post here, sorry, physically present, is that a motif is a more delicate way of mounting lighting on a lamppost essentially than a festoon is. That's it. It's a sort of terminology change without any substantive output, essentially, in terms of visual impact. That's my understanding. I wasn't personally present when the individuals went to the square and were talking.
I'm a little confused because my understanding of a festoon is it sort of goes from one side to the other.
Okay, thank you.
So if that's what we're proposing, that's different to the offer that we've had previously, and hence the sort of the query around what does that relate to when you start looking at the spec around 27 motifs? I'm confused.
If I could maybe respond. So in the past, I believe we've had motifs. That's what we had last year and the year before. And the intent this year was to look at having festoons, which is much more of a daisy chain between lampposts. Although I understand at least one of the suppliers has indicated that's not possible, but that's certainly what the request to suppliers was.
If I could add to that, the reason that we moved to motifs, if that's what we're going to call them, is that there can be problems with the electrical supply. So the only kind of festoons that I understand are possible is if you do a zigzag. And previously we used to have them parallel to each other. And you can't do that because you can't get electricity to all of them safely and under our control. So I shall be interested to see what the proposal is for festoons.
But I just come back and that's what confuses me, because I'm looking at in the report it says about festoons, but then in the exempt tender, I think under the same company the costing relates to 27 motifs. So it's either one or the other, but it can't be both. But there's an inconsistency there. So that does need to be resolved, and I'm not sure whether we're going to be able to answer it tonight. But I think that's for TCM to sort in terms of what we want to or what's feasible. I think residents are always very happy to see festoons, having spoken about them historically. But I think if it's not possible or safe to do so, we just need to think about the practicalities of it. And before we just say, and also think about then if we're using motifs, what we've got at the moment, I guess, is classed as a motif. Are we looking to then change? If we were to change, is it different specification, or is it a different one, or do we retain? And that's another question if we're not doing the festoons.
So if I could from the chair and just say, I think we're very much getting into the realms of TCM here. So I think the intent of bringing this specification to this committee is that, and actually it's a bit late in terms of the approval. It should have been approved before it even went out. But so we are somewhat doing this retrospectively. But what the recommendation 2 is essentially asking is that we approve the fact that the request that has gone out to suppliers for quotes is as Appendix A, and that the detail based on their responses will be considered by TCM at the TCM meeting. With the values concerned of these items, and they are individual items, they're not all coming back as a single tender, they're coming back across multiple suppliers for parts of them rather than one whole tender. It is under quotes as opposed to the tender process. So it is, we don't have to rigidly stick to what is in the specification when the ultimate decision is made as to what is selected. So I think essentially what's been asked for is, in retrospect, do we approve that this is what's gone out as an initial request to suppliers?
Well, I'm not prepared to alter my proposal, but if my proposal isn't seconded, so be it. But I just think that we should have had a discussion about this probably at TCM a bit earlier, because there is stuff here that we're wasting time looking at because it's just not practical this year.
Agreed. Yeah. Okay, so we have a proposal that's been seconded to accept items 1 and 3. All in favour of those? Okay, that's unanimous. Does anyone wish to make any further proposals in respect of the other recommendations at this point? If not, then yeah, in which case.
The only question I have is, we note the electrical installation improvements. Do we need to put a proposal that is researched with regard to the method of funding and by whom?
Yeah, Councillor Russell. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add the point that I think Councillor Knight made, that we need to understand the essentials so that we're safe for this year's Christmas offer, as opposed to the way it should be to be suitable for other things that we need to put on in the market square.
Okay, so that is a proposal, assuming you're happy with the amendment there, Councillor Strong, to investigate and get quotes for the requirements for the electrical infrastructure on a basis of what's essential and what is a nice to have or improvement, and to seek funding sources for that. Yeah, yeah.
Can I make an observation, Chair? So I guess I think what members are saying here is an extremely valid point, and the fundamental point here is it is not town council land. It is the responsibility of Central Bedfordshire to ensure that there is a safe working environment for all of our market holders and for any events. So I'm trying to understand what the benefit would be of the town council doing that. Surely the responsibility is for Central Bedfordshire to carry out that assessment for themselves and to satisfy themselves that what they're offering is entirely appropriate in the circumstances and fulfills all health and safety regulations, isn't it?
So from the chair, before I go to other members, I'd just like to say that I guess the concern there is, if we challenge Central Beds, they could turn around and say, well, you're the ones who have the meters, you're the ones who pay the bill, we're not going to invest, so you'll have to just not have electricity in the square. That's the risk. So we need to be more collaborative, I think. But Councillor Bond.
It's more than just electricity in the square. We handed over all our light columns to Central Beds, and a lot of these light columns had X number £100 spent each to have MCBs put into them as we extended all the lighting many years ago. So in theory, those bits should be perfectly okay for exactly what they are. So we've handed all that over to Central Beds. So it's not our responsibility, but we're actually making use of those connections for our lights. So I think really it'd be a bit silly. I think we really need to actually get the assessment done for ourselves so we can understand the quantum, rather than expecting Central Beds to do it when it's really for our benefit.
Councillor Russell.
I would agree with what's just been said, and also say that we are up against time here. And if we don't do it ourselves, it's not going to get done in time.
Good.
If I may, my exact point was that, I mean, we're either going to do it or we're not. And if we don't do it, one way or the other, it needs to be done. We're going to fight about the costing element. And that's not sort of throwing town council money away. I think we just got to be realistic about it. If there is some funding that we can pull somewhere else at some point in the future, if need be, let's do that. But I think we've got to make things safe for our residents. So I think we just need to, whilst it's, I think it was the proposal to investigate what the costs were going to be. I think we do need to do that, but I think there also needs to be some realism around, it's not a Christmas thing as such, but it needs to be done before Christmas.
Councillor Storm.
Just as a point of information, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if I recollect it, this council did pay a considerable sum of money to Central Beds Council for the lights to be taken over by them to make sure that they were up to standard. So I recollect it was something like a six-figure fund to get so that we got rid of that responsibility. So that just needs to be, if the clerk wasn't aware of that, I think that's something that it should be borne in mind.
I remember signing a cheque.
That's in relation to the street lighting, though. I'm not sure if that's the same as the lighting PowerPoints that are around the market square for the Christmas lights, the separate boxes labelled Christmas lights.
No, it's not that, but as Councillor Bond said, each time we put a motif on a lamppost, we had to spend £300 odd to put something within the electrics within the lamppost to support the motif. So we've not only handed over 100,000 to Central Bedfordshire for the light columns, we've also spent for each column where we've had a motif, we've spent another £300. But, you know, if I could just pick up on Councillor Foster's point, I understand what he's saying to be practical, but we still need to know the difference between what do we need to do for Christmas and what might be desirable afterwards, in which case we can haggle about who's paying what.
Yeah, so just to paraphrase the proposal then, is to investigate the requirements for the electric infrastructure in the market square, in particular what is essential for ongoing operations and for Christmas, and what is more nice to have or improvements for the future, and to investigate the potential sources of funding for each. That's proposed and seconded. Final comment, Councillor North, and then we'll move to a vote.
Well, I would just like to say, picking up, I mean, accepting everything that Councillor Foster said about timing and everything, that is quite right. But I do think that the point that the town clerk made about trying to pursue Central Beds to get them to pay for it and pointing out to them that it is their responsibility is something we should do, even if it might not work, it might not succeed, but it's worth a try.
So I think that's covered by the proposal. Yes. So I'll move to a vote. So all those in favour? Any against? No, because everyone's in favour. Okay, that was unanimous. Thank you. And there were no further discussion on that report, I believe. So we now move on to the next item, which is the fire risk assessment. So Mr. Hosseini, if you could introduce this one, please.
Okay, thank you. So I was just getting to the right section on my laptop. So the report essentially covers the significant improvement works which are required both on physical infrastructure across our estate and annual maintenance as well, to ensure that all kind of red rated actions which have come up in the various reports are switched to amber and green swiftly, and then enable us to achieve full fire safety compliance across our estate. Essentially the salient, well, many salient points, but being as brief as I can, there is circa £1,500 shortfall, which is identified in the report, which in the funding allocation presently for the 22-23 financial year, based on the received quotes to date. And we have done a fairly rigorous exercise on that as well in terms of procurement of quotes. Additionally, there currently is, and there always has been in a sense, a fire safety culture piece of work which is required, which officers have all undertaken. I can provide some assurance on that. And we are implementing to roll that out with all staff to ensure that fire safety is fully complied with at all assets across the estates. That might also include in future things such as people booking spaces and having a clause written in there, sort of allowing them to kind of be fire safety aware at all times for users across our estate, including things like sports activities, etc. I'll pause there.
Would you mind if I ask the officer a question? So just for absolute clarity here, and I know we've gone through financial regulations here to make sure that we have the right number of quotations and from the right people with the right expertise. This is a lot of work to be done. Yeah. Do we have absolute assurance that the quantum of work is all absolutely essential to enable us to be safety compliant?
Yes, I think so. I think the quantum of work required is probably, to answer the question as directly as I can, what's been quoted and what is available is required, and therefore there will be an overhang in terms specifically around one asset, I suppose, where we're doing even more work to it to make it fire safety compliant. That shortfall needs to be covered to ensure that we're all fire safety compliant.
And just to remind ourselves, members voted for growth in the budget from 21-22 to 22-23 of £8,000. Yeah, as a guide figure to try and source this level of expenditure. When you've actually got quotations, they are in excess of that figure. So you're effectively coming back and saying that we need more growth if members decide to vote for the entirety of the project. Is that right? Yep.
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay, so I've got a couple of questions, but I'll go to other members first. Councillor Knight, you were indicating
Thank
first.
you. Yeah, so I think we have to do this, to be honest, but just a quick sort of sanity check question, really. So 9 sites are mentioned, they're not all listed. Are all those sites used? Are any of them sublet? Do any of the tenancy agreements place the onus on the tenant rather than us, or are we liable for maintaining all of them? I think they're the main questions I have.
Thank you. I think ultimately we would be liable in the event of something happening, in terms of risk and issue essentially at that point, and catastrophe, etc. Not to give a kind of direct answer as I can in terms of all elements across our estate. There's one area in particular, one kind of asset, should we say, where my own thinking is a personal response here, in a sense, as an officer. We could be kind of looking to do a different approach to fire compliance in that particular area. I can't really say too much more, I don't think.
Could I answer that, Chair? Yep. Yeah. There are further discussions that are taking place connected to capital assets review. I think this kind of links in part to this. I think there's a broad opportunity here for the council to be better aware of what a good lease looks like, what a right lease looks like, where the responsibility is split between the council and anybody who is renting a piece of land or property from us. And I think I'd expect, as part of the capital assets review, for colleagues to make sure that we're in a good place associated with that. I think some of this is historical practice, which may not necessarily have been the right practice.
Councillor Bond.
Sorry, excuse me if I'm slightly confused here. I understand we've got a figure in the budget and we're being told now this is actually greater than the budget. I'm looking at 4 different quotations and the descriptions against every single one is identical. So these are 4 quotes for the same work, rather than why have we summed it together as a total? To say it's in excess of our budget. So I must be missing some point here.
I think you've misread the report. Only one of those figures is brought forward into the total allocation.
So from you were saying about the budget we have, we're actually...
We've already, in addition to these 4, the money in the quote, we've already spent money on other things, and there's an additional quote for other work.
Thank you, sorry about that.
Councillor Foster.
Yeah, just in relation to PAT tests, when I first read the report, the quotes make reference to PAT tests for 9 assets. And I then then see the paragraph underneath, which then refers to PAT testing will be conducted by trained members of staff. So perhaps there's some ambiguity there, and it may be my ignorance. So I'm happy, but so there's a question around that, and then the second thing is around if PAT testing is being done or is to be done by members of the council staff. Who are they? Are they trained? Do we have the capacity to do so? But it's certainly it's too confusing when you read the report.
So before I ask officers to confirm, my understanding was that due to the position we're currently in with PAT testing, that the intent was that the quote that includes PAT testing gets us to a place where everything is tested, but that then in parallel our staff are trained to maintain that going forward. And I presume that would be members of the public realm staff. But that's
So for absolute clarity, you're correct in that assumption. So it feels like it's a sensible thing to do. We will constantly have to do PAT testing rather than externalizing it and paying for it. It makes perfect sense to train up our own staff. We've reached out to more of our technically proficient public realm staff in the expectation about asking for interest in getting trained, so that we've got that kind of skill base internally for future need.
Let's come back on that, please. It doesn't say that in the report. It doesn't say what it says. It says PAT testing for 9 assets, and then says due to unknown number of electrical items. Doesn't make any reference to the PAT testing in those sites. It says the staff are going to be doing it. So are we saying that the quotes then include all the PAT testing on all the 9 assets, all the 9 sites as a one-off, and then going forward, the PAT testing will be done by the staff? Is that what the report's saying?
Thank you, Councillor Foster. So the report, actually, you're absolutely right, isn't clear enough. And it should say, essentially, there are several hundred items, if not low thousands worth of devices, which of all sorts, which need PAT testing. The 9 assets, you're absolutely right, is across the entire footprint that we have.
So just so to be clear, the PAT testing in the quote is covering all of the PAT testing on all 9 sites. The 3010 or whatever, that covers all of it, and then future we then be being trained. Thank you.
Councillor Bond.
I'm just curious to know what the legal position is, the frequency of PAT testing, because I know years ago it used to be annual. I don't think it is anymore.
So part of the training that I know, this as a trained PAT tester myself, and I know Councillor Knight is as well, that part of the training covers what the requirements are in terms of frequency, and there's very clear guidance around how to determine what frequencies are required. So it's not it won't be annual for every item. It can be longer, it can even be shorter than that, depending on the nature of the equipment. Councillor Strawn.
2 questions just to try and finish off PAT testing once and for all. If we if members of our own staff carry out PAT testing, can we be assured that we remain fully insured and compliant, and that we don't need to have external PAT testers to ensure that we are compliant?
The short answer to your question is absolute yes.
Thank you.
Just to be clear as well, and I think this is important to stress this, it's very, very important that we play catch up for a large chunk of testing that we want to keep on top of in the future.
No difficulty with that. Secondly, on the financial side, I note the quotation, the budget allocation, but I also note that in February this year, we spent £2,665 on work being carried out, which is included in the overall figure that we're looking at of some 9,389. When was this actually paid? Was it paid in the last financial year or in the current financial year? Because if it's paid in the last financial year, that should come out of the equation, and therefore we're within budget for the current financial year.
The answer to your question is new financial year. It's current year expenditure.
Right, I just noted that the works carried out last year. I just wanted to ascertain whether it was paid that last year or this year.
Was it not accrued at the end of the financial year?
Yeah.
So therefore it should come out of last year's budget?
I'm not certain it was accrued, but I know that the work was completed in the whole year.
So it should have been accrued then? Yeah. So I think I've got, to summarise, I've got a couple of questions myself. So firstly is, we only appear to have one quote for the town council office building work requirements. So presumably this is saying effectively that that will be the maximum amount, and we'll have further quotes for that work, for the new doors and the ground floor storage cupboard ceiling. So the maximum additional expenditure would be the 1389, but I think it's also important that we clarify around that, whether that accrual took place or not. And then the final question would be, should there be a requirement, because it wasn't, the previous year's expenditure wasn't accrued as it should have been, then where is it proposed that the variant comes from to cover that?
If I may, on the first question, I might seek assistance, if you like, from the town clerk on the second question on the vehement for this year, if it's were to be needed. On the first question, we're still looking for a number of, we've got some quotes for this particular asset that we have. And it has not been the case that we can find one supplier to fit everything from fire doors to other essential kit that's required. So we've had to go to break out again and find various suppliers which will meet the right timelines to do the correct work. So I hope that sort of answers the first question in terms of procurement and quotes.
So if I can paraphrase what you just said,
Yeah.
You're saying that the 3714 is the sum of a number of quotes for different elements of the work, not a single quote for one supplier.
Yes. Shall I answer the second question?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I don't think I'm in a position today to give you a specific vote heading that would then be the source of the 1389. I think I need to go away and give you further advice about where that's going to come from.
Okay. So my expectation would be, if there's a proposal for a variant, then we need to know where we're doing it from and to. We can't approve it otherwise. So I'm not sure where we can go in terms of proving that. Councillor Foster first, then Councillor Russell.
Just in relation to the table 2223 budget allocation, in reference to the annual maintenance and 9 assets line, it's got a quote to number 301. There seems to be something in brackets in advance of the, where it says annual. Is that supposed to be in there? I don't think it should. So I'm just intrigued as what, so we've got to be careful on that. And the other thing it says about annual maintenance, is that a one-off? Or is it, so presumably this is a one-off thing rather than an annual thing. So
it's this year's annual maintenance cost.
Okay.
So presumably it will be lower in the future because it wouldn't include PAT testing. Councillor Russell.
I understand the reservation on approving this without knowing where the environment would be, but I do think that this is essential to go ahead as soon as possible. So I think we should accept both of the recommendations on the paper, but I wouldn't be so happy if it was more than £1,300. But I mean, we know that's a small amount given our overall budget, and we know that this work needs to be done. So I think I would propose that we accept both those recommendations, but have an explanation at our next FNGP meeting.
Councillor Storm.
Yeah, could I just ask a question on, if we approve the recommendations Councillor Russell suggested, does it go as a recommendation to council or a resolution?
It's resolution, I believe. We've got the power to do it. Yeah.
I was just thinking that with the environment and the uncertainty over it, if it went as a recommendation to council and the clerk could provide us with the answer for the council meeting next week, we could then actually get the right resolution passed.
I think the clerk can tell us now where it'll come from.
So we have a repairs and maintenance budget under section 904. There's a figure of £1,500 available unspent, and we can source it from there.
Okay. So the proposal is to do the environment of 1389 from that repairs and maintenance to the fire maintenance. Was that subject to confirming the requirement of it due to whether it was accrued or not last year? I
think it should be, but
yeah,
that's fine. So we're accepting the recommendation, subject to the environment, subject to subject to the accrual and subject to the environment from repairs and maintenance.
Yeah. Okay.
Just one other point.
Do we have a seconder for that?
Second it.
Yeah.
Can I just
Yeah,
make a
Councillor
point?
Foster.
I love council speak, as you know. Is there the need for the word holistically in this report? Thank you. I don't think there is.
Okay, I think we've got a proposal that's duly seconded. All in favour? Any against? Was that in favour, councillor? No. So that's unanimous then, thank you. Okay, I think that's my agenda. I think we're on to public open session again. On items of information. Yes, so items of information, CCTV updates. Mr. Saini.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, let me just get to the right bit here. So I can confirm that officers met with colleagues separately from CBC over a fortnight ago regarding this important matter to discuss both separately our town council strategy development on CCTV, all the most recent updates, if you like, and the new town council requirement of 58,000 or so of section 106 funding. Having spoken with one colleague from CBC just yesterday, I believe, afternoon, they have spoken with another colleague within CBC and confirmed that the historic town centre S106 pot, which had gone to a large supermarket chain in town at the time, that is entirely exhausted. We knew that already a while ago. And they have sort of proposed to us the sort of moderately good news at this stage of a new pot which they were looking at, which is an allocation pot, which I won't necessarily read out here, but it's got quite a long application number to it, which totals £33,000 and 81 pence. Sorry, £33,081 and 40 pence. So that is what's on the sort of symbolic table at the moment for us to potentially draw down, subject to this being able to go through to the correct spending officer in CBC first. So that's subject to that provisos already.
Okay, so I will open this up to the
Yeah.
members, but my understanding is there's a big pot of hundreds of thousands available for town centre improvements. But councillor Bond first and then councillor Russell.
That's the question I was going to ask, which is clearly we've been told we have a figure of £700,000, which will more than cover for this. But also, when you refer to CBC colleagues and they spoke to another CBC colleague, can we have any clarity as to who you spoke to?
Certainly, sorry. So I essentially spoke with Steve Barrett, who sort of leads the entire CBC sort of CCTV strategy, and Beverly Gaynor as well. Sorry.
Councillor Russell.
I thought that the person who was in charge of the town centre section 106 was our friend Sam Corbett. He was supposed to be the officer in charge of that. So why are we dealing with Steve Barrett and Beverly Gaynor? You know, and how has that 700, 800,000 suddenly disappeared? What is it being allocated for? Because nothing's happened in the town centre up to now. Are they expecting to spend that money on something else? In which case, can we please know what? Because it's a large pot of money. So, I mean, this is totally unsatisfactory. I'm sorry.
Can I help?
The members first.
Yeah. So just to give councillor Russell some clarity, the gentleman that you referred to is responsible for managing the whole sum not the individual elements. He's responsible now for the whole, managing the whole sum. As I understand it, Karim and others have been speaking to individual, what they call spend officers, who are responsible for individual elements of spend that make up the overall amount. Yeah, is that right? Cool.
Yes, but we
Councillors.
need money from the overall amount. We can't be limited to what Mr Barrett or Miss Gaynor have got in their pots. We've got to go to the overall budget.
Agreed. Yep, come back.
Thank you for the Councillor Russell as well for the prompt. Absolutely happy to engage with the individual who controls the entire allocation on this topic. I mean, I think there's a way forward with this, and it's starting to sound glib for myself. I appreciate that, but you know, there is still a timeline running on this where we can align ourselves with CBC's kind of switch over, if you like, you know, when that will happen. So I mean, that needs to happen from a sort of technical aspect, I think, actually, but well, I'm not the expert there. In terms of the funding side, though, certainly happy to, you know, pick up the phone and engage as I need to. Indeed, as July and August approach as well, as in the next month with other things on the
Okay,
table.
Councillor Bond.
Yeah.
Let's talk about timelines. You mentioned that you've been on the phone yesterday. Considering that we made a decision, a meeting was several weeks ago. How long has this been taken, and have we actually? We've only just got an answer now that we can't get the money after all this time.
Well, Councillor Strawn first.
This funding is absolutely crucial. We can't hang around going to individual pots. As far as the CCTV changeover with Mr Barrett is concerned, he's totally irrelevant as far as I can see to this particular exercise. We've made the decision as to what we're going to do. We need the equipment so that we can do the changeover. Without that, there's no point in talking to anybody about a changeover without ordering the equipment. There's a time limit on that equipment. We need the money so that we can submit the order now, not in a week's time or 2 weeks' time.
So,
Councillor Mack.
Councillor Strong's stolen a lot of thunder. I was going to try to rumble. Yeah, I think there is a lot of urgency around this. It's evident that there is something of a crime spree in town at the moment. Many businesses have been burgled, and I just heard of another one this evening, which is quite distressing. It is likely the cost of this equipment is going to escalate because there are rumours that some of the alternative suppliers, not the suppliers we have chosen, because we already decided we were going to go with a UK-based supplier for good reasons of ethics and morality, but some of the other suppliers, the cheaper suppliers, may suffer from a trade embargo. And if that happens, we can expect the remaining suppliers to have a very big order book, a shortage of supply, and we can expect that to be passed on to us in terms of long lead times and increased costs. So it's not just about stopping the crime. Actually, if we get the 58,000 in 6 months' time, it won't be enough. We'll need 100,000. So I think we need to escalate this to the top of central beds and be very vocal about our request. And we need to get this kit ordered. You know, I said when we made this decision, I would like to see it installed in August, and I would still like to see it delivered and installed in August next month. And I'd like to see a project plan which outlines the milestones and how we're going to achieve that. And I completely agree. We should be running completely independently of any plans central beds may have for future control centres. I think that's irrelevant to us, and it's my understanding that we do not have a dependency on them.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So I agree with nearly absolutely everything that Councillor Wright-Knight has just rightly said. And it's certainly there is urgency in certainly in the cost inflation type cost scenario, let's say. So as soon as we get this done, the better, for many reasons, you know, including the fact that I've arrived there, was it 10 months, 11 months ago, and this has been lingering for a long while. So absolutely happy to pick up the phone with the individual required and start top down, I suppose, in that sense, and work that way on this, using this as a way forward. Still hand in hand though with CBC.
Okay, so I think it's the feeling's quite clear. We need to move this forward, escalate into the necessary officers, and I think that probably includes yourself, Peter, with the with other officers at central beds if required. And I think we need to consider how we, and we can't make the decision today as it's for information, but consider how we might move forward to start the ordering process for at least some of the equipment in advance of securing all of the funding, and maybe bring a proposal back to council next week or shortly thereafter.
The fact that we've had this in an oral update, it would have been helpful to have had at least some sort of, and I appreciate we do have to do oral updates. It's very difficult. I appreciate that. It's, I'm just not a fan of oral update, but I know that you can't put everything in writing, but to actually have this sort of news in an oral report just means that we can't prepare for that in a way. We could have perhaps had conversations as a ward council. I could have perhaps had a conversation in advance of it just to be more prepared, but I'm not, and I don't like being on the back foot.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next item, which is item 10B, Apollo Gardens.
Apologies, Mr. Chairman. I should have declared a non-pecuniary interest in this item at the beginning of the meeting. I was half asleep on that respect. So can I declare it now, please?
Okay, noted. Over to you, Mr. Sami.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, okay, Apollo Gardens and lots of other play areas on the same estate, and potentially open spaces on the same Kings Reach estate as well. Is the kind of update I'm about to give. That'll be by negotiation on the sort of open spaces element of that. So recently, when I say recently, it's probably about 3 weeks or so ago, we had a formal response from CBC to the letter that we had sent out, which confirms that indeed a deed of variation is definitely required to enable any kind of direct land transfer in principle, and to allow our town council to gain transfers directly, essentially. We knew that already, and it's now come back again in a rebooted form. So the deed of variation work has now commenced. The process has begun and will take approximately 3 months to complete. That's what I'm being told. And that will be done between CBC and their legal team, and of course the developer in question and their legal team. At that point, the town council will be with our legal partners, will be able to agree directly with the developer, commuted sums for Apollo Gardens and first, if you like, and then arrange for the transfer of that particular area to take place, and then of course other areas to come, each with their own legal wrapper essentially, because they all require their own legal due process for them. On the 7th of July, this Friday I believe, I'm having a meeting with CBC, with their legal representatives, potentially with the developer as well. I think if that can be coordinated by the CBC side, funnily enough. And I very much look forward to pushing this forward in earnest at that point. Now, we should, I'm ever hopeful, but at long last, there is some light being cast here, essentially, in terms of clarity. I'm hopeful that after this 3 to 4 month process, even if it has to be with a deed of variations done, we can still get Apollo Gardens over the line. The question for me still remains outstanding is how quickly we can get the other areas on board this financial year or not. And I'll leave that open in the ether because I'm not a legal expert.
Pass comment, Chair? Yeah. So, this is not a surprise comment. Apollo Gardens has taken far too long to conclude upon. It's taken years to conclude upon. And, a thank you goes out to Crim for his hard work and others in getting it to where it is today. It's my hope and expectation, and I've been talking to colleagues at CBC, that at long last we can use this success as a very clear point of reference about what the defined process should look like. I don't want to be in this situation for all of the other potential play areas that we may or may not want to take on, and or green spaces that we may want to take on. And what I've said to Karim and colleagues at CBC is, this is not a sequential exercise. These things can happen at the same time once council have decided that this particular play area is something that they might wish to take on and is in a good state of repair to take on, and that the funds that were transferred to us are consistent with our own expectations and costs. So let's hope that we've got some accelerated opportunity here now to do something. At the same time, I think members need to be thoughtful when Karim has got that information, that actually you need to go through this in a systematic way and say this particular play area is something we want to take on. This green space may not be something we want to take on, but we need to have a kind of clear business case associated with those and absolute clarity around intelligence around each. Yep. So, but I don't want each one to be done and take a year. We can do a number of things once the members have given us direction.
So I've got a question, if I may, conscious of the fact that we've not made any decisions to actually look to adopt any other play areas. But does the deed of variation cover the potential for other areas as well as Apollo Gardens, or is that specific to Apollo Gardens itself? Okay. Oh, okay. Any other questions?
If I may, it seems to me that it's a matter of urgency to try and to get the ball rolling. I appreciate what you're saying, Peter, about we've got to establish a process. So it seems like we've established a process. We can't take over any of these sites until we know whether council approves it or not. So it needs to be on either a councillor agenda or certainly at the minimum plus to say this is what needs to, are we minded to take these over or not? And then what work is required for each of those areas before we are minded to take them over. So that's a lot of work in terms of preparation, because we can't just say we'll take over whichever one without knowing what's included and what's not, and whether it's the standard. Some of the equipment isn't perhaps to the standard that we would want it to be. So, but with that in mind, and we're concentrating clearly on spending money on our own assets. Potentially, we've got other assets that could be brought into the town council, but there's a commuted sum that could come from that. So I think we've just got to get that work going as well. I have to say I was perhaps a little confused around what you were saying, Karim, about the timing, and that we can then negotiate with the developers at what point. So I'm perhaps misunderstood the process of what you were saying there. So, but are you saying that in 3 to 4 months' time, the deed of variation happens, and then we are then in position to discuss? I think I got lost, to be honest.
Really? If you want to answer that. Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I'm obviously not a lawyer or legal, expert in any sense. Of course, I'm conscious that others may be around the table. Clearly, so my understanding is I'm also slightly confused, and I'm not trying to, sort of going as fast as we can on this. I want to be absolutely sure of the exact process, including the legal process. I'm at slight odds at this particular point, having had a conversation with somebody quite high up, I think at CBC, that it may be possible, my understanding was, I'm going to just go on a limb here if I may, and happy to be corrected, that after the deed of variation is done for an entire estate potentially, I don't know if that's possible or not, then it could be easier to, if you like, batch the transfers sort of not in one go, because each, as I said, require their own legal wrapper and their own due process. But whether or not it's going to be in time for this financial year, I genuinely don't know. And we've been told that that's very difficult by CBC. I'll pause there.
Right. Councillor Storm. First.
I think there are a number of aspects here. One is it seems to be quite clear we need to have an understanding of a process, that how this is going to occur in the future. I had an understanding that the town council actually had a direct contract to take over Apollo Gardens, and that was I'm not sure why a deed of variation is necessary there. And thirdly, I think we need to understand the process and get something to PLOS with a list of these sites that are under consideration sooner rather than later, and with a full explanation of the processes being suggested, so that we can ensure that we're actually the right party to the right part of the agreement, because whether it's under section 106 or whatever planning agreement is, who's actually responsible, but that needs to go to PLOS, and then we can hopefully get a report back to this committee that we're going to be getting a lot of money to support these places.
Okay, Councillor Bond.
I also seem a bit confused what's going on here, because I'd understood before that they were going to be transferred to us. I don't understand why it's due to variance, unless of course it's being transferred to Central Beds first and then us. I understand there is a 106 agreement, so there must be the idea, the commuted sums must be planned within those, within that 106 agreement. So I said we do need clarity what's going on here, because I had understood it could be transferred straight to us without Central Beds, and that's what the agreement was.
Can you support me on this? Let's just get some clarity around this. So it was certainly my impression, and it always has been my impression, that this was very clear and straightforward. And that was that there was authority effectively to transfer Apollo direct to us. There was no requirement to go anywhere else. It has taken an astonishing amount of time. We've knocked down a lot of trees and lots of telephone calls and actually found out that is not correct. Central Beds at the highest possible level, including escalation to the chief exec by myself, have clarified that actually it's not the case. That actually Apollo goes from Apollo to Central Beds to Town Council. That's what has to happen. But it's taken a long time to get to that point, and lots of unfortunate delay.
Seems to remember something around the audit.
Yeah, but I also understand, and I think Councillor Bond has alluded to it, that the commuted sum should already be agreed. So what is all this about Town Council having to agree the commuted sum?
I believe from when I've seen previous items around Apollo Gardens, the commuted sum is agreed at that point, but then you've got to negotiate inflation and things like that because the time we're actually receiving the money is so many years on from when it was initially agreed.
Surely if that's section 106, it should be CBC, not us.
Yeah, I think we need to bring this to a close, but yeah, final
As fast as I can, thanks, Mr. Chairman. So just in support actually of the town clerk, I can confirm there has been an agreement in principle of sorts, because it's in a sort of letter as such, yeah. You know, that historically a direct transfer at the time may have been viable. Unfortunately, I think that let's put it this way: the pandemic occurred, and through the last 10 months that I've been working on this, I think I've deciphered that there has been a blockage within. I think I've reported this before at council. That there's been a blockage within CBC and their legal providers, and I think it's a well-known issue they're having internally anyway, in terms of that, and in terms of workflow and cases coming through. So I'll pause there.
Okay. Do any other members have any comments? Otherwise, I'll move on. Okay, that brings us on to public open session. We still don't have any attendees online or in the room, so no public open session. So brings us on to exempt items. Will someone move that we move into exempt session?
Move it.
Okay, thank you.